The battle had ended only hours before. Smoke still drifted across the fields, hanging low in the cold air. Wrecked vehicles lay scattered along the road, some burned down to twisted frames. The ground was soft and wet, torn apart by shellfire and tank tracks. American infantry moved cautiously through the area, checking for snipers and clearing debris. Medics worked quietly, tending to the wounded. Behind them, a column of German prisoners was being marched toward a temporary holding area. The men were exhausted and silent, their faces gray with mud and fatigue. Their uniforms were worn and patched. Some limped, others clutched at their arms or shoulders, wounded but still able to walk. As the column reached a crossroads, the prisoners passed close to an American field kitchen that had just been set up. The smell hit them first. Coffee, strong and rich, rolled through the cold morning air. It mixed with the sharp scent of meat and onions simmering in giant pots. The smell was so strong that some of the prisoners slowed their steps without meaning to. Guards prodded them forward, but their eyes stayed fixed on the scene unfolding only a few yards away. American cooks moved quickly between stoves and tables, ladling stew into metal containers and cutting fresh loaves of bread. Steam rose in thick clouds, visible even from a distance. Soldiers lined up with their mess kits, waiting their turn. They were dirty and tired, but their faces were calm. They spoke to each other quietly as they moved forward in the line, knowing that soon they would have a hot meal. Some were already sitting nearby, eating hungrily, their rifles leaning against tree trunks or stacked neatly in piles. A few laughed at a joke, their breath hanging in white clouds as they ate. For the German prisoners, it was a scene almost impossible to understand. They had been living for weeks on cold bread and thin soup, when it was available at all. Their own field kitchens were few and often destroyed by air attacks or abandoned during retreats. Meals came sporadically, usually in the form of tinned meat or whatever could be taken from villages along the way. Many had gone to sleep hungry for days on end. Now, here at the front line, they saw an enemy army serving fresh, hot food to hundreds of men as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Several prisoners whispered to one another as they walked. One shook his head slowly, staring at a pot of stew large enough to feed an entire company. Another muttered that the Americans must have endless supplies. The words carried a mix of disbelief and resignation. A few of the younger soldiers glanced around nervously, as if fearing punishment for speaking. Their expressions told the rest of the story. They understood, in that moment, that they were up against a force not only better armed but also better fed, better supplied, and better organized. The realization cut deep. Hunger had worn them down. Now they saw proof that their own army could no longer compete. On the American side, the scene was almost routine. For the cooks, this was simply their job. They kept the stoves running and the food moving, knowing that in a few hours they would have to pack up and follow the troops to the next position. For the infantrymen, a hot meal was more than food. It was a sign that the system supporting them was working. Even in the chaos of battle, there was order. A man could fight knowing he would not go hungry at the end of the day. The battle had ended only hours before. Smoke still drifted across the fields, hanging low in the cold air. Wrecked vehicles lay scattered along the road, some burned down to twisted frames. The ground was soft and wet, torn apart by shellfire and tank tracks. American infantry moved cautiously through the area, checking for snipers and clearing debris. Medics worked quietly, tending to the wounded. Behind them, a column of German prisoners was being marched toward a temporary holding area. The men were exhausted and silent, their faces gray with mud and fatigue. Their uniforms were worn and patched. Some limped, others clutched at their arms or shoulders, wounded but still able to walk. As the column reached a crossroads, the prisoners passed close to an American field kitchen that had just been set up. The smell hit them first. Coffee, strong and rich, rolled through the cold morning air. It mixed with the sharp scent of meat and onions simmering in giant pots. The smell was so strong that some of the prisoners slowed their steps without meaning to. Guards prodded them forward, but their eyes stayed fixed on the scene unfolding only a few yards away. American cooks moved quickly between stoves and tables, ladling stew into metal containers and cutting fresh loaves of bread. Steam rose in thick clouds, visible even from a distance. Soldiers lined up with their mess kits, waiting their turn. They were dirty and tired, but their faces were calm. They spoke to each other quietly as they moved forward in the line, knowing that soon they would have a hot meal. Some were already sitting nearby, eating hungrily, their rifles leaning against tree trunks or stacked neatly in piles. A few laughed at a joke, their breath hanging in white clouds as they ate. For the German prisoners, it was a scene almost impossible to understand. They had been living for weeks on cold bread and thin soup, when it was available at all. Their own field kitchens were few and often destroyed by air attacks or abandoned during retreats. Meals came sporadically, usually in the form of tinned meat or whatever could be taken from villages along the way. Many had gone to sleep hungry for days on end. Now, here at the front line, they saw an enemy army serving fresh, hot food to hundreds of men as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Several prisoners whispered to one another as they walked. One shook his head slowly, staring at a pot of stew large enough to feed an entire company. Another muttered that the Americans must have endless supplies. The words carried a mix of disbelief and resignation. A few of the younger soldiers glanced around nervously, as if fearing punishment for speaking. Their expressions told the rest of the story. They understood, in that moment, that they were up against a force not only better armed but also better fed, better supplied, and better organized. The realization cut deep. Hunger had worn them down. Now they saw proof that their own army could no longer compete. On the American side, the scene was almost routine. For the cooks, this was simply their job. They kept the stoves running and the food moving, knowing that in a few hours they would have to pack up and follow the troops to the next position. For the infantrymen, a hot meal was more than food. It was a sign that the system supporting them was working. Even in the chaos of battle, there was order. A man could fight knowing he would not go hungry at the end of the day. Officers moved through the area, checking on their units and speaking with the men. They understood the importance of what was happening here. A well-fed soldier fought better and lasted longer in combat. This was not sentiment. It was military necessity. General Patton and other senior commanders had made it clear. Logistics were as vital as rifles and tanks. The field kitchen was part of the battle plan, just as much as artillery or armor. If a division ran out of food, it could not hold ground. If it had hot meals, it could push forward again tomorrow. One lieutenant paused near the prisoners, watching them as they passed. He noted their thin faces and ragged clothes. Then he turned back to his own men, who were eating stew and fresh bread only a few steps away. The contrast was stark. He did not speak of it, but the difference told its own story. His men were ready for the next march. The prisoners were finished, beaten not only by weapons but by hunger and exhaustion. As the column of Germans moved on, some turned their heads for one last look at the steaming pots and the soldiers gathered around them. It was a sight they would not forget. For them, it was more than food. It was a display of power. It showed that the Americans could fight and feed their men at the same time, something the German army could no longer do. In that moment, the war's outcome seemed clear, not through speeches or battle maps, but through the simple act of serving a hot meal beside a muddy road. The field kitchen crew continued their work, focused and steady. They knew the next wave of men would arrive soon, hungry and cold, needing strength before moving on. In the distance, trucks rumbled closer, bringing more supplies. The war moved forward, and the kitchens moved with it, feeding the army one steaming pot at a time. In the weeks that followed the Allied push through France and Belgium, German prisoners of war began to write home whenever they were allowed. Many of their letters were intercepted by Allied intelligence. The words revealed something more than battlefield reports. They told of shock, envy, and quiet despair. One soldier, captured near Aachen, wrote to his brother that he had seen pots of soup as tall as a man, full of meat and vegetables, with bread piled higher than our ration wagons could ever carry. He described American supply trucks lined up for miles, each loaded with food. In his letter, he confessed that he no longer believed Germany could win. The Americans, he wrote, fought with full bellies and endless strength. His own unit had been living on half rations of dry bread and horse meat before their surrender. Another diary, taken from the pocket of a fallen German corporal, told a similar story. In the pages smeared with dirt and water, he recounted marching past an American camp and smelling coffee, a luxury his unit had not tasted in months. He wrote that the scent stayed with him for hours, even as he marched away hungry. His words were bitter but tinged with reluctant admiration. He admitted that the enemy's ability to feed its men in the field was beyond anything he had imagined. To him, it was proof that Germany was fighting a machine too vast to overcome. German troops had been trained to expect hardship. They were used to thin rations and long marches. But by late 1944, what they endured went beyond military discipline. Hunger gnawed at their morale. When they saw American soldiers eating steaming meals only steps from the front lines, it was not just a reminder of their own hunger. It was a visible sign that their army was collapsing. Some whispered among themselves, wondering how their leaders could send them to fight under such conditions. Others fell silent, carrying their thoughts inside. Among American troops, the mood was different but just as deeply felt. Soldiers who had been fighting for days without rest spoke of the relief they felt when they saw a mobile kitchen set up ahead. Men came in from cold foxholes and muddy trenches, shivering and late 1944. The war in Europe was grinding toward its bloody end. After months of fighting since the D-Day landings in June, American forces had pushed deep into France. The hedgerows of Normandy were behind them, but ahead lay the forests of Belgium, the rivers of the Low Countries, and the fortified towns guarding Germany's western border. The advance was steady but costly. Each mile was earned through bitter fighting. Rain soaked the fields and roads. Mud clung to boots and vehicles. Winter's cold settled over the countryside, turning every movement into a test of endurance. As the front lines shifted almost daily, supply units faced a challenge as great as any battlefield commander. Tens of thousands of soldiers needed to eat every single day. They needed calories not just to fight, but to march, dig, carry, and survive. Feeding them was a task of staggering complexity. Fixed kitchens in the rear could not keep up with fast-moving offensives. Supply depots were often miles behind the front, too far to provide hot meals in a timely way. In response, the U.S. Army deployed one of its most practical innovations, the mobile field kitchen. These field kitchens were designed to travel. Each one could be hitched to a jeep or truck and moved wherever the troops went. They were compact but rugged, with gasoline or coal-fired stoves built into metal trailers. Inside were compartments for boiling, frying, and baking. They were simple enough to be operated by a small crew, yet powerful enough to feed hundreds of men. Fresh bread could be baked in the field. Stews and soups could be prepared in large batches. Coffee, a staple for American troops, could be brewed in vast quantities. The entire system was engineered for efficiency, allowing food to be cooked near the fighting rather than transported cold and stale from far away. This design solved a critical problem. In previous wars, soldiers often went days without a proper meal, surviving on cold rations. Now, hot food could be served wherever the fighting happened to be. The effect on morale was immediate. A warm meal after a cold march or a night in a foxhole restored strength and steadied nerves. It was more than comfort. It was fuel for combat readiness. Officers recognized that well-fed men fought harder and endured longer. A reliable food supply meant divisions could stay on the offensive without pausing to rest or fall back to regroup. Across the lines, the picture was far grimmer. German forces were stretched thin and in retreat. Allied bombing had destroyed roads, rail lines, and bridges. Fuel shortages crippled movement. The Wehrmacht still used its own field kitchens, known to the troops as Gulaschkanonen or goulash cannons, but there were too few to meet demand. German soldiers in many units lived on whatever they could find. Stale bread, hard biscuits, thin cabbage soup, or scraps taken from local farms. Meat was rare. Coffee was replaced by bitter substitutes. In the worst cases, no rations arrived for days. Hunger became as much an enemy as the advancing Allied forces. Malnutrition weakened soldiers physically and mentally. Desertion and despair increased. The contrast between the two armies became starkly visible during the winter campaigns. As American units pressed forward, their mobile kitchens rolled with them. Supply trains followed closely behind with flour, beans, vegetables, and canned goods. Even under fire, the system kept running. German prisoners of war marched past these kitchens and supply vehicles for the first time, and their reactions were often recorded by Allied officers. Many were stunned by the sight. The smell of beef stew and fresh bread hung in the cold air. Coffee steamed in tall metal pots. Some German soldiers stared silently, unable to hide their amazement. Others spoke quietly to one another, shaking their heads. They had been living on scraps, while the enemy seemed to possess a limitless bounty. Captured letters and diaries reveal their thoughts. One soldier wrote of his disbelief at seeing entire American regiments sit down to hot meals just yards from the front lines. Another described how this sight convinced him the war was lost. If the enemy could feed so many so well while advancing, how could Germany hope to win? For some, the realization was demoralizing beyond words. It was not just about food. It was about what the food represented: industrial strength, organization, and resources far beyond Germany's reach. American troops, meanwhile, took the system for granted. To them, it was simply part of their daily life. After a long march, they lined up with mess kits in hand, knowing there would be something hot to eat. Even basic meals like beans or cornbread lifted spirits. In the freezing forests of Belgium, during the battles that would become known as the Ardennes Offensive, the presence of hot coffee and stew could mean the difference between holding the line and breaking under the strain. Officers understood this deeply. General George S. Patton was known to remind his men that an army's success depended as much on logistics as on tactics. In his words, an army marched on its stomach. For Patton and other commanders, the mobile field kitchen was a weapon as real as any rifle or tank. As the war dragged on, the gap between American abundance and German scarcity widened. Every hot meal served by a mobile kitchen was a small victory of organization and planning. For the men on both sides of the conflict, it was a daily, tangible sign of who was winning and who was falling apart. The mobile field kitchen was one of the most practical pieces of equipment the U.S. Army used in the final year of the war. It did not have the dramatic look of a tank or the firepower of artillery, but it quietly kept whole divisions moving forward. The most common model was the M1937, later replaced by the improved M1942. Soldiers often called it the rolling kitchen. It was built as a trailer that could be towed behind a truck or jeep, allowing it to move as easily as the troops it served. This mobility meant that hot food was no longer tied to fixed bases far behind the lines. Meals could be cooked and served almost anywhere the army went. The design was simple and rugged. The trailer held heavy-duty stoves that ran on coal or gasoline. There were separate compartments for different kinds of cooking. One section could boil water for coffee, tea, or washing mess kits. Another was used for frying or baking. Large pots and kettles sat securely in place, even while the trailer was being moved. The layout allowed several dishes to be prepared at the same time. Bread, beans, meat, and vegetables could all be cooked in one continuous process. The kitchen crew could begin cooking soon after they arrived at a new position, and within an hour or two, hundreds of meals were ready to be served. Each rolling kitchen was designed to support a company or battalion, typically feeding 200 to 300 men at a time. Larger formations, such as divisions, used many kitchens operating together. These were organized into field service companies, which were part of the Army's Quartermaster Corps. The planning behind their work was precise. Supply trains moved on strict schedules, carrying flour, canned goods, meat, vegetables, and coffee beans. These trains followed the front as it advanced, ensuring that kitchens were never far from fresh ingredients. Food was delivered in bulk, often in standard wooden crates or metal cans that were easy to stack and transport. Even under fire, these deliveries continued, supported by truck convoys that brought in supplies day and night. One of the most remarkable capabilities of these mobile kitchens was their ability to bake fresh bread right on the battlefield. Specialized ovens were included as part of the equipment. This was not just a luxury. Bread was a staple food, rich in calories and easy to distribute. Before the invention of mobile ovens, armies relied on hardtack or other preserved bread, which was dense and difficult to eat. Now, soldiers could receive soft, warm loaves that boosted both morale and nutrition. The smell of baking bread became a familiar sign that a meal was near and that the army's logistics system was working as planned. The impact of this system went beyond convenience. Soldiers who ate hot meals were healthier and more effective in combat. Proper nutrition reduced sickness and fatigue. Warm food also helped prevent frostbite and other cold weather injuries during winter campaigns. In the mud and snow of Northern Europe, these factors could decide whether a unit held its ground or broke under pressure. Commanders understood this. Feeding troops was treated as a military operation in itself, planned with the same care as an attack or defense. On the German side, the situation was very different. The Wehrmacht also had field kitchens, often called Gulaschkanonen or goulash cannons, because of their tall, chimney-like smoke pipes. These were used throughout the war, but by late 1944, they were few in number and poorly supplied. Many German units were scattered and on the move, retreating in the face of constant Allied attacks. Their kitchens were slower to deploy and could not match the speed of the American rolling models. Fuel shortages made it difficult to keep stoves burning. Even when a kitchen was available, there was often little food to cook. Allied bombing had cut off many supply routes, leaving entire divisions with only what they could scavenge. The difference in daily rations between the two armies was stark. American soldiers typically received meals that included bread, meat, vegetables, and coffee. Even in combat zones, they were given food that was hot, plentiful, and varied. German soldiers, in contrast, often survived on cold bread and tinned meat. A thin soup might be provided when supplies allowed, but it was rarely enough to satisfy hunger. As winter deepened, malnutrition became widespread. Weakness and illness spread through the ranks. Soldiers were sometimes forced to take food from civilian farms or even from abandoned enemy camps. The superiority of the American mobile kitchen was not only in its design but also in the system that supported it. Behind every kitchen was a chain of trucks, depots, and planning offices. Quartermaster officers tracked every crate of flour, every bag of coffee, and every pound of meat. They ensured that kitchens had what they needed, where they needed it, and when they needed it. This kind of logistical precision required coordination across thousands of miles, from U.S. factories to European battlefields. The rolling kitchen was the final link in that chain, the point where planning turned into a hot meal in a soldier's mess kit. For German troops, seeing this system up close was a shock. Prisoners of war often described their astonishment at the sight of American kitchens in action. To them, it seemed almost impossible that an army could cook and serve so much food, so close to the fighting. It was a visible reminder of the industrial and organizational strength behind the Allied advance. Where the Wehrmacht struggled with scarcity and improvisation, the U.S. Army projected abundance and efficiency. This difference was felt in every battle, in every march, and in every cold morning when one army woke to the smell of fresh bread and the other faced another day of hunger. The strength of an army is measured not only in the number of its men or the quality of its weapons, but also in its ability to keep those men moving, fighting, and alive. By late 1944, this truth became clear on the battlefields of Western Europe. The U.S. Army's use of mobile field kitchens gave it an advantage that went beyond the simple act of cooking food. It shaped the pace of the campaign and the morale of the troops. It affected how battles unfolded and, ultimately, how the war was decided. For American soldiers, a steady supply of hot meals meant more than comfort. It directly influenced their combat effectiveness. Soldiers who ate well were stronger and healthier. They recovered faster after long marches or intense fighting. They were less prone to illness in the bitter cold of winter. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, where the Battle of the Bulge would soon erupt, frostbite and trench foot became major threats. Hot meals, especially warm liquids like coffee and soup, helped prevent these conditions. This was not a small matter. Fewer cases of illness meant more men ready to fight, more squads at full strength, and fewer replacements needed from already stretched reserves. The psychological effect was equally important. Soldiers who knew they would be fed did not face the added stress of hunger. Their minds stayed focused on their tasks rather than on survival. A hot meal at the end of a long day reminded them that they were part of a system that cared for their needs. This trust built confidence not only in their immediate leaders but in the army as a whole. When men believed their commanders would keep them warm and fed, they were more willing to push forward into danger. This trust was as valuable as any weapon. Across the front, the situation for German troops was the opposite. Their supply lines were in ruins. Allied bombers struck railways and roads day and night. Fuel was so scarce that many vehicles were abandoned. Food shipments often failed to reach frontline units. Soldiers went hungry for days, surviving on half rations or less. Malnutrition set in, weakening bodies and minds. Hunger dulled alertness, slowed reaction times, and eroded the will to fight. In winter, these effects were magnified by the cold. German soldiers marched through snow and ice without proper gear, their strength fading with each step. The collapse of German logistics created a sharp morale divide between the two armies. American troops gained confidence as they advanced, while German units lost hope as they retreated. Captured reports from German commanders described rising rates of desertion and breakdowns in discipline. Some units stopped obeying orders simply because their men were too weak to carry them out. When these starving troops saw American forces eating hot meals within sight of the front lines, the psychological blow was severe. They understood that they were fighting an enemy whose resources seemed limitless while their own dwindled to nothing. This difference in supply did more than shape morale. It determined how each side could move and fight. Mobile field kitchens allowed U.S. units to stay on the offensive without pausing for extended resupply. Armies of the past often had to halt after major battles to rebuild their stockpiles of food and ammunition. The Americans faced no such delay. Their kitchens traveled with them, fed by a constant stream of trucks and supply trains. A division could march through the night, fight in the morning, and eat a hot meal by midday. Then it could keep moving forward. This operational momentum was a key reason why the Allied advance gained speed after the breakout from Normandy. German forces, by contrast, were forced into a defensive pattern. They lacked the supplies to sustain long offensives. Even when they launched counterattacks, such as the Ardennes offensive, their operations were fragile. A single disruption in fuel or food delivery could halt an entire army group. Many German units relied on foraging, taking food from local farms or towns. This practice slowed them down and created tension with civilian populations. It also made planning difficult, since no one could predict exactly what resources would be available at any given time. The result was a constant state of improvisation, while the Americans followed a precise, reliable system. The rolling kitchen became more than a tool. It became a visible symbol of the industrial power that supported the Allied armies. Each pot of stew and loaf of bread represented factories back home producing stoves, trucks, crates, and cans. Behind every meal was a network of railways, ships, warehouses, and planning offices stretching from the United States to the front lines of Europe. This network functioned with remarkable efficiency. It allowed American soldiers to fight with full bellies while their enemies went hungry. It demonstrated that modern war was as much about organization as it was about courage or tactics. To German prisoners, this realization was bitter. Many wrote later that they had not understood the scale of the American war machine until they saw it firsthand. The sight of entire units being fed near the battlefield drove home the point that they were outmatched not only in numbers but in resources. Even if they won a local skirmish, they knew the Americans could replace their losses and return the next day with the same strength. This knowledge wore down German morale faster than direct combat ever could. For the Americans, the presence of mobile kitchens reinforced their own confidence. Soldiers came to trust that no matter how far they advanced, the system would keep up with them. They did not worry about where their next meal would come from. This allowed commanders to plan bold maneuvers without fear of starving their men. It also gave the army a sense of inevitability. Each day's advance was followed by a hot meal, a signal that progress was being made and the war was moving toward its end. In this way, the humble field kitchen played a role far greater than its size suggested. It was a constant reminder of the strength behind the front lines. It showed that victory did not come from firepower alone. It came from the ability to keep men supplied and ready, day after day, mile after mile. On the muddy roads of France and Belgium, amid the chaos of battle, the rolling kitchen kept the American army moving forward while its enemies fell back, weakened by hunger and doubt. When the war ended in 1945, millions of soldiers returned home and armies across the world began to study what had worked and what had failed. Tanks, aircraft, and new weapons received most of the attention, but in military planning rooms, another lesson stood out. The ability to feed troops in the field had been as important as any victory won with guns or bombs. American field kitchens had proven that large armies could stay supplied with hot food even while moving rapidly across enemy territory. This was more than comfort. It was a fundamental part of how the United States had been able to fight a global war on two fronts and win. The mobile kitchen itself became a model for future conflicts. In Korea, just a few years later, the U.S. Army faced brutal winter conditions and difficult terrain. Mountains, deep snow, and sudden enemy attacks made supply operations challenging. The lessons from Europe guided the way kitchens were deployed. Crews used the same basic trailer design, now improved with better stoves and more compact layouts. Trucks carried food directly to frontline units. In some cases, helicopters even delivered rations when roads were blocked. The idea that soldiers should have a hot meal no matter where they were became standard practice, not a luxury. Commanders saw how this affected morale during bitter fighting at places like the Chosin Reservoir. Well-fed soldiers were more alert, recovered faster, and were able to keep fighting under extreme stress. During the Vietnam War, the mobile kitchen evolved again. The terrain was entirely different. Thick jungles and monsoon rains made movement difficult. Large bases were set up, and from them, food was delivered to smaller outposts. Mobile kitchens were still used, but they were adapted to match the environment. Lighter equipment allowed crews to move through narrow trails or set up in temporary camps. The focus on providing warm meals continued, even in remote areas. By then, military planners understood that food was not only about physical strength. It was about connection. A hot meal reminded soldiers that they were part of a larger effort, supported by people they might never see. This understanding came directly from experiences in World War II. The influence of these wartime kitchens also shaped how modern armies planned their logistics. In earlier wars, food was often treated as secondary to weapons and ammunition. After World War II, the U.S. military began to integrate feeding systems into every level of strategy. Rations were standardized, storage methods improved, and transport routes carefully mapped. By the late 20th century, armies had developed highly efficient systems that could feed thousands of troops in multiple locations without interruption. The old M1937 and M1942 trailers were replaced by modern field kitchens with better fuel efficiency and safety features, but the basic concept remained the same: mobility, speed, and reliability. For the soldiers who fought in Europe, the memory of those kitchens stayed with them. Many veterans spoke of how important the simple act of eating a warm meal had been during long campaigns. They remembered the smell of fresh bread baking behind the lines, the taste of coffee after a freezing march, and the sight of cooks working through the night to be ready for the next day. These memories were often as vivid as those of battles. They were reminders that war was fought not only with weapons but with people who needed to be cared for. German veterans, too, carried memories of what they had seen. For many, the first time they encountered an American field kitchen was a moment of realization. They understood then that they were fighting a war they could not win. In post-war memoirs, some described the shock of seeing endless supplies of food while their own army starved. One former officer wrote that the sight of American troops eating hot meals in the middle of a battlefield was more demoralizing than any tank or plane. It symbolized the industrial and organizational strength that Germany could never match. These reflections became part of the broader understanding of why the war had ended the way it did. As decades passed, the story of the mobile field kitchen faded from public memory. Tanks, planes, and famous battles took center stage in books and films. Yet, among historians and military planners, the kitchens remained a key example of how logistics could shape the outcome of war. They were quiet proof that the less visible parts of an army could be just as decisive as the frontline fighters. The rolling kitchens of 1944 and 1945 were small, often overlooked, but they represented the backbone of a global campaign. Modern military meals trace their origins back to these wartime innovations. Today, soldiers often eat MREs, or meals ready to eat. These are sealed packets containing complete meals that can be carried in a pack and eaten anywhere. While very different in appearance, the idea behind them is the same: provide reliable, nutritious food in any condition. Modern field kitchens still exist, now equipped with advanced technology. They can be set up quickly, operate with minimal fuel, and produce meals for hundreds of soldiers at a time. The efficiency and organization seen in these systems are direct descendants of the work done by the Quartermaster Corps during World War II. The legacy of the mobile kitchen also extends beyond the military. Emergency response teams, humanitarian aid groups, and disaster relief organizations have adopted similar principles. Portable kitchens are now used to feed people after hurricanes, earthquakes, or floods. The ability to bring large-scale food production to remote or devastated areas comes from techniques first developed to keep armies supplied during war. In this way, a piece of wartime technology has continued to serve in peacetime, saving lives and providing comfort in times of crisis. The story of the mobile kitchen is not one of glory or dramatic battles. It is a story of planning, engineering, and persistence. In the mud and cold of Europe, these kitchens showed that an army could be sustained in motion, day after day, without faltering. The men who built, maintained, and operated them were often unseen, working in the background while others fought at the front. Yet their work shaped the outcome of campaigns and, ultimately, the war itself. They left behind a legacy that still influences how armies and nations think about the human side of conflict, reminding us that even the simplest acts, like serving a hot meal, can have far-reaching effects.